All right, so welcome back. Is God omnipotent? Part 3. We're going to look at the two powers of God. So we kind of looked at this last week and digging it more. How can God act absolutely reliably without being subject to some external agency which compels God to act this way? It's something that would make God, whether, for us it's police or parents or the threat of detention or whatever it is. So this question was debated with some heat in Paris in the 13th century. It's what they did for fun in the 13th century. 1200s, they argued about, how can God act reliably without an external force. So in response to a form of determinism, now determinism is when God determines everything. And we think God determined Bill to walk in right now. God determined me to flick this bowl. Every single thing is determined by God. In response to a form of determinism linked with the writer Averroes, this kind of caused this big uproar. For Averroes, the reliability of God ultimately rested upon external pressures. He believed God was compelled to act in certain ways and thus acted reliably. Now, this approach was, however, regarded with intense suspicion by most theologians who saw it as a crude denial of the freedom of God. If something compels God, then God isn't totally free. And they didn't like that. But how could God be said to act reliably unless it was through some sort of external compulsion? So that's when theologians are kind of trying to think, okay, how can we trust God? Because that's really the ultimate thing about faith. We can trust God that this is still true. What's said in the Bible is true today. What's true tomorrow, and what the idea that we're saved by grace through faith is still valid today. How can we trust that? That's what people are thinking. So the answer given by writers such as Duns Scotus and William of Ockham can be stated as follows. The reliability of God is ultimately grounded in the divine nature itself. God does not act reliably because someone or something makes God act this way, but because of a deliberate and free divine decision to act like this. So it's a decision of God to act in a certain way. Now that's also a bit circular. We know God acts this way because God decides to act this way. Now in his discussion of the opening lines of the Apostles' Creed, it's I believe in God the Father Almighty, Ockham asks precisely what is meant by the word Almighty, omnipotence in Latin. It cannot, he argues, mean that God is presently able to do everything. Rather, it means that God was once free to act in this way. God has now established an order of things which reflects a loving and righteous will, and that order, once established, will remain until the end of time. It's kind of like, you had a choice, and you could choose. It's like, okay, at Thanksgiving, there are 10 pies out there, and you only have room for 2 pies. So before you decide, you have 10 options. But once you choose, you've made your choice. You can't go back and uneat 2 and eat the other 8. It's like when your parents say, you may choose one dessert, and for a while you could choose any of them. But once you've made your choice and eaten it, those other options are no longer present. So that's kind of what Ockham is saying. In the beginning, God could choose God's nature. God could choose anything. But once God chose, it began a limiting off of other choices. So this kind of goes in between ideas of 2 kinds of power. So Ockham uses 2 terms to refer to these different options. The absolute power of God refers to the options which existed before God had committed God's self to any course of action or world ordering. So that's like you still have those 10 pies to choose from. The word ordained power of God refers to the way things now are, which reflects the order established by God, the Creator. Ordained power is like, well, now you've made your choice, you have the power to eat that pie. It's like, when you ever play games with kids, sometimes they set the rules, and have you noticed they sometimes change the rules in the middle of the game to suit themselves? Have you ever noticed that? I find that happens a lot. So in theory, once you set rules of a game, you have to abide by the rules. If you keep changing them in the middle of the game, there's chaos and no one has any fun. So it's kind of like with creation, God sets the order, and now that's the order. You can't go back and change it. So now God has to work within margins and some self-imposed limits based on the order God created. So these do not represent two different sets of options now open to God. They represent two different moments in the great history of salvation. And our concern is with the ordained power of God, the way in which God orders the creation and presence. So, absolute power of God, before anything happened, God could do anything. But God sets some decisions, sets some order of things, and now can't go against that order. So what's the difference between absolute power and ordained power? So Occam is inviting us to consider two very different situations in which we might speak of the omnipotence of God. The first is this: God is confronted with a whole array of possibilities, such as creating the world, not creating the world. God can choose to actualize any of these possibilities. World's God's oyster. This is the absolute power of God. God can do anything, be anything. But then God chooses some options and brings them into being. We are now in the realm of the ordained power of God, a realm in which God's power is restricted by virtue of God's own decision. It's kind of like once you decide to go to church, you can't have always stayed home because you'll have to went to church. You can't be in two places at once. So Occam's point is this: by choosing to actualize some options, God has to choose to not actualize others. You can't have your cake and eat it too. Choosing to do something means choosing to reject something else. You either sleep late or you go to church. You can't both sleep late and come to the 8 o'clock chapel service unless late to use like 7 a.m. You can't be two places. There are choices you have to make. God is within the logical realm of choices. So once God has chosen to create the world, the option of not creating the world has to be set to one side. You can't choose not to create because you already created. In theory, you could choose to destroy, but you could never go back and change the fact that you yourself created. This means that there are certain things which God could do once, which God can no longer do. Although God could have decided not to create the world, God has now deliberately rejected that possibility. And that rejection means that this possibility is no longer open. Sometimes we like to think the idea that we can just have this idea that God can do anything. And we can say, well, it doesn't make sense to us, but God can do it. You're not really saying anything then. It becomes unintelligible. Well, God could do both options at the same time because God is God. But where in the Bible do you see God completely upsetting the laws of all logic and nature? It's nowhere. We almost want to put this magic God can in front of it and somehow make meaningless, illogical sentences make sense. And I think that does a disservice to God and how God is in the world. So let's talk about the possibility of paradox. So this whole thing leads to what seems at first sight to be a paradoxical situation. On account of the divine omnipotence, God is not now able to do everything. By exercising the divine power, God has limited options. For Occam, God cannot now do everything. God has deliberately limited the possibilities. God chose to limit the options which are now open. Is that a contradiction? Well, no. If God is really capable to do anything, then God must be able to become committed to a course of action and stay committed to it. This notion of divine self-limitation, explored by Occam in the Middle Ages, is actually really important to modern theology, and we'll talk more about that next week. We talked about that in the last series about Can God Suffer? People like Terence Fretheim, in his book, The Suffering of God, argues that in the Hebrew Scriptures, in the Old Testament, we see a picture of God who limits God's power and actually allows God's self to suffer by a self-choice. We see that choice in Scripture. So it becomes really important in modern theology that God limits God's own power in order to be in a right and real relationship with humanity. Because if you have all the power and someone else has no power, there's not an actual relationship there. It goes back to the story I told a while back. You've all seen the classic movie Coming to America with Eddie Murphy, right? It's a classic movie. It's based on a parable by Kierkegaard. It's the same thing as the story of the prince and the pauper and all this stuff. Kierkegaard calls it divine incognito. So he tells this parable of a prince who wants to find true love. But the prince knows if the prince shows up as the prince, he never knows if the woman actually loves him because of him or because he's the prince and she wants money and title, or because he's scared to say no, because he might be scared the prince can then chop her head off. Kings have been known to do that. So he never actually knows if this was love or because of his position and power. So he dresses as a commoner, goes and works at McDowell's, and tries to find love that way so it's real, and then reveals himself to be the prince. Kierkegaard calls it the divine incognito. Jesus comes to earth, doesn't just coerce people, doesn't do all this magical stuff like, boom, I've jumped off the pinnacle of the temple and I was caught by 10,000 angels like Satan tells him to do. Because Jesus wants to tell, here's the way to live, will we do it? Here's the God who loves you, will you love God back? That's what God longs for, right in real relationship of love and following. And if God exercises all that power to be coercive, to determine all of our lives, then no relationship is real. That's why God chooses in the beginning to limit God's power. We see that throughout the Hebrew scriptures. God doesn't just make things constantly happen. God can work the system, does some things. We see constantly God trying something else, God trying something else, asking the people to return. Instead of just making them, we see God's basically feelings being hurt. So we'll talk more about that and how modern theologians have kind of used this idea from Occam and others of self-limitation as we think of the larger umbrella of God's omnipotence. Any questions? Alrighty, I will see you next week.